Well, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak to you today. It's a special time of year for so many, and I'm pleased to have the chance to share a bit about Judaism and more specifically about Hanukkah. And I wanted to thank you for the welcome, especially Miriam for the reading Light in the Window, and for Sandra for the song Ma'od Zor, Rock of Ages, which is traditionally sung at this time of year in recognition of Hanukkah. At sunset this evening, we begin the 8th and final day of the holiday. My family and I will sing a blessing, light 36 candles, 9 for each of the 4 of us still living at home, and exchange simple gifts with each other. We may even eat pan-fried potato latkes and deep-fried jelly donuts called sufganiyot in celebration. In no way will what we do resemble a celebration of the incredible martial victory, bloody and brutal, that sits at the very origin of this strange festival-like thing we call Hanukkah. How did it get to be this way? With many families in America celebrating a holiday that originally commemorated hard-won Jewish independence by decorating Hanukkah bushes, wearing ugly blue and white sweaters, or chasing around a little fellow called a mensch on a bench. And when religion manages to enter into it, how is it about miracles of light, God's providence, and hopes for peace? My hope in speaking with you is to share some of the complexity and some of my perplexity about Hanukkah, to allow you to see one of the fundamental tensions within Judaism brought into resolve by this peculiar holiday. While I'm speaking, I may use terms or refer to people or events you may not be familiar with. Please insist on clarification. I believe there is some time reserved at the end of the service to discuss, and I would love to know what questions you have, especially since Hanukkah is a difficult knot to untangle. It is often easier to gloss over the inconsistencies and confusing bits, thinking it's one's own shortcoming. With Hanukkah, that is hardly ever so. I take the story of Hanukkah's origin back to the great untier of knots, Alexander the Great, specifically to the division of his empire at the time of his death. 4 generals fought for its control, and so the empire fell into roughly 4 regions. 2 were the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria. The Holy Land of Judea was sandwiched in between and, for the time being considered, was governed by the Seleucids. Without going deeply into the tensions in the Holy Land so situated between rival kingdoms, suffice it to say that King Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, sought unity within his kingdom and instituted a rigorous Hellenization around the lands of Syria. This policy largely outlawed Jewish practice and worship, requiring the Jews to worship the gods of Greece. To punctuate that, the temple in Jerusalem was defiled and converted into a temple dedicated to the worship of Zeus in 168 BCE. This included the slaughter and sacrifice of unfit animals, including swine. One of the priests who would have served in the temple, Mattathias Maccabee, and his 5 sons fled Jerusalem and began a guerrilla campaign against the Syrian Greek army that grew into a rebellion. And ultimately, 4 years later, in 164 BCE, Mattathias' son Judah Maccabee led the recapture of Jerusalem and Judea, the restoration of the temple, and as they were a priestly family, the recommencement of the Jewish cultic practice. Ironically, in the fine Greco-Roman tradition of celebrating military victories with a festival, the Maccabees instituted a celebration they called Hanukkah, meaning rededication. It was to commemorate the rededication of the temple, the recapture of Jerusalem, and reinstitution of the traditional cult. In their waning days of the conflict, the Maccabees had been unable to observe the festival of Sukkot, which occurs earlier in the fall and which celebrates the bringing in of the harvest to Jerusalem. So they patterned this rededication on the 8-day festival of Sukkot, giving us a new 8-day celebration to commemorate the martial victory, the might of the Maccabees, the power of a determined few over the massive military power of the Syrian Greeks, a celebration of the priestly Maccabees wresting independence for Judea and freedom for Jewish culture and religious observance. I'm told much of this story is contained in the book of Maccabees. I've never read it, however. Strangely, it is not part of the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh. It is relegated to the Apocrypha, those books decidedly ruled out of inclusion in the Tanakh. Where Hanukkah does enter Jewish holy text is in our Talmud. The Talmud, in Tractate Shabbat, records an argument between the sages that occurred nearly 450 years after the Maccabean rebellion. They were arguing over when and how one kindles the lights of Hanukkah. And when the text asks, what is Hanukkah? We are now given a story that the Greeks defiled all the oil that was used to keep the menorah lit. The menorah was the holy lamp of beaten gold that stood in the outer holy section of the temple and was to be lit continuously. The Greeks defiled all the oil by their touch, except for one cruse. During the rededication of the temple, there was enough oil for the menorah to burn for only one day, but the priests were able to keep it lit from that one cruse for 8 days. It was, the rabbis claimed, a miracle. In my teaser for this talk, I tipped my hand a bit, claiming that this miracle may be an example of what is known as a pious fiction invoked by the rabbis. The holiday, as the rabbis of the Talmud would have us believe, is not a commemoration of the military victory, not a glorification of the priestly Maccabees and their wit and cunning when Judaism stood on the verge of collapse, but a recasting of the holiday as commemorating a miracle of oil, of the divine hand in history. We see this echoed in the last line of the first verse of Ma'ot Zor, Rock of Ages. And your word broke their sword when our own strength failed us. This hardly lauds the significant military accomplishment of the Maccabees. Why should such a recasting, such a fiction be necessary? I offer two reasons, one cynically political, another historically pragmatic, and both only partly true. Rabbinic Judaism evolved from the body of the Pharisee movement. One aspect embraced by the Pharisees was the democratization of the faith and a more narrow focus on the ethical dimensions and social justice elements of the Torah. That sect was in large part opposed to and opposed by the Sadducees, the priestly sect that represented the entrenched upper segment of Israelite culture. A key focus of the Sadducees, as priests, was maintaining the temple cult and continuing established ritual practice. The conflict between the Pharisees and the Sadducees was, at times, extremely contentious, even violent, as is documented in several places in the Christian Bible. In this struggle between the rabbis and the priests, it would not do to have the power of the priesthood affiliated with martial might and glorious victory. And so 450 years after the Maccabean rebellion, we are reading in the Talmud a new history as written by the victors of this doctrinal and social conflict, a history that elevates as fundamental to a festival an otherwise unattested miracle. Another opinion is that the rabbis recognized that the commemoration of military victory and martial might had proven exceptionally dangerous to the continued existence of the Jewish people. This had been proven time and again since the Maccabean revolt. Rebellion against the Romans had resulted in the devastation of Jerusalem and destruction of the temple in 70 CE. And 2 generations later, in 132 CE, another large-scale rebellion led by Shimon bar Kokhba resulted in the death of nearly 600,000 Jews, the devastation of the land, the suppression of any practice recognizably Jewish. Bereft of the temple, traditional religious practice, access to Jerusalem, and the lives of untold generations of descendants, the rabbis pragmatically recognized the danger of this militaristic mindset and sought a new paradigm for a clearly dangerous story. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, of blessed memory, would go on to claim that the rabbis also recognized the incredible irony of this festival in the aftermath of these disastrous expeditions against the Romans. Were we really going to sing festively about the rededication of a temple that no longer stood? Glorify martial prowess while barely surviving in exile? Celebrate an independence that lasted barely 100 years between the time the Maccabees retook Jerusalem and Emperor Pompey knocked down Jerusalem's gates? No, the rabbis saw in this story a different narrative. The battle between the Maccabees and the Greeks was not a military conflict. The true battle was the cultural one against assimilation. The Maccabees' triumph was not their guerrilla tactics against the Greek phalanx, but their persistence and faith when faced with the challenge of suppression and assimilation. The symbol to celebrate is not a standing temple and a free Jerusalem, but a single tiny cruse of oil fueling a religious light that simply will not go out. That is the spirit to celebrate, the message to carry forward for the generations. Not a mighty outstretched arm, but the word carried forth in time. The light of Jewish continuity that will not dim and has been burning now for over 3,000 years. These are 3 opinions. There are others. And so you may see some of my perplexity in observing the manner in which Hanukkah is observed in America today. We are once more in the teeth of a cultural war that threatens to exterminate Judaism through its assimilation in an overwhelming culture. How ironic that Hanukkah has become one of the principal vehicles for that assimilation. There's a joke that all the Jewish festivals can be told as the same story. They tried to kill us, they couldn't, let's eat. But as true as that is of Hanukkah and Passover and Purim, it is only Hanukkah of all the festivals, and the very least of the festivals, that is blended and assimilated so thoroughly in popular culture. The idea of a Hallmark special celebrating Purim is a lampoon, but a Hallmark special about Hanukkah, of course, and more than one. Some Jews and many rabbis choose to see in this irony another lost front in the battle to maintain Jewish identity and doom for our continuity into the future, into the next 3,000 years. They see families avoiding the challenges of being different, cowering from requiring their children to forego the symbols and excesses of Christmas, addressing those same symbols and that same excess in a veneer of Judaism. Not one morning of presents, but 8 nights of gift giving. Whatever is Christmas red and green becomes Jewish if gilded instead in blue and silver. But I am more hopeful than these rabbis. In her book, Hanukkah in America, Diane Ashton sees these markers of assimilation as something that is unique to the Jewish experience in America and not a callback to the assimilation challenge cited by the rabbis. The new popularity of Hanukkah reflects the desire of Jews to push back on the hegemony of Christmas, to show that our religion is relevant, carries a message of interest and value, and is approachable. The focus on approachability, with many elements of modern Hanukkah celebration and popular depiction emphasizing our characteristic good humor, is a means of reaching out and being accessible to the rapidly expanding number of interfaith families. Hanukkah is morphing into a vehicle showing the interfaith, the marginalized, and the disaffected Jew that their heritage is consequential and not to be hidden. I prefer to see these ironic markers of assimilation favorably. Though attached to a festival that originally celebrated independence, I see them in the context of the continued evolution of the festival, an evolution that the rabbis and sages of the Talmud themselves set into motion with their pious fiction. In such a way, it may even be fitting that Hanukkah is the battleground where Judaism, once again, may shine forth. Thank you.